There is a machine sitting on a desk in Shenzhen right now that represents the final fatal crack in a 40-year-old monopoly. It is a laptop. It weighs just 798 grams. It is thinner than a standard notebook. And inside it sits a processor that was never, ever supposed to exist. For 4 decades, the personal computer industry has been locked inside an invisible cage called Wintel. Windows on the screen, Intel or AMD on the motherboard. It was an unbreakable duopoly. If you wanted to build a PC, you paid the rent to California. And when the United States government placed Huawei on the entity list in 2020, the tech establishment breathed a sigh of relief regarding the PC market. They assumed Huawei might scrape by in smartphones. But the laptop market? Impossible. You cannot build a PC processor without an x86 architecture license, which is legally locked down. And even if you tried to use ARM, you cannot build a competitive, power-efficient PC chip without TSMC's advanced lithography, which is physically locked down. The trap was perfect, legal on one side, physical on the other. And then, on the 29th of July, 2026, Huawei stood on a stage at the HarmonyOS Technology Conference and unveiled the Kirin XE90, a 10-core, highly energy-efficient processor designed specifically for personal computers. It does not use American architecture. It was not manufactured in Taiwan, and it is currently shipping inside a laptop that competes directly with the thinnest, lightest machines from Apple and Dell. This is happening right now, today, in 2026. The Wintel cage just had its door kicked off the hinges from the inside. If you want to understand how a sanctioned company just built the 3rd major computing ecosystem on planet Earth, hit subscribe. It genuinely helps this channel bring you more deep dives like this one. Let's get into it. To understand why a laptop chip from Huawei is a geopolitical earthquake, you have to understand the fortress they just breached. And to be fair to the incumbents, the Wintel Alliance earned its 40-year monopoly through sheer, undeniable engineering gravity. The personal computer revolution was built on the x86 instruction set. Intel invented it, AMD licensed it, and Microsoft built the entire Windows operating system to speak it natively. Every piece of enterprise software, every PC game, every accounting database, every legacy driver for a printer built in 1998 was written for x86. The software gravity was so immense, so dense, that it created an insurmountable moat. If you wanted to build a laptop, you had 2 choices. You could use Intel, or you could use AMD. Both are American companies. Both are deeply integrated into the United States export control apparatus. Now, to be fair, there was a 3rd player that recently disrupted this. Apple. Apple proved that you do not need x86 to build a world-class laptop. They moved to ARM architecture with their M-series chips, achieving battery life and performance that made Intel sweat. But Apple's success relied on a very specific, very fragile premise. They had unlimited VIP access to TSMC's absolute bleeding-edge 3nm and 4nm EUV manufacturing nodes. This created the ultimate trap for China. The Chinese domestic market is massive. The government, the military, the state-owned enterprises, the universities, they all need millions of laptops, but they were buying them from Lenovo, Dell, and HP, all running Windows, all powered by Intel or AMD. The entire digital infrastructure of the Chinese state was running on rented American silicon, executing American intellectual property. When the tech war escalated, the vulnerability became existential. If Washington decided to revoke x86 licenses or ban Intel from selling to Chinese state entities, the Chinese bureaucratic machine would grind to a halt. You cannot run a modern government on computers you are legally forbidden to buy. China tried to fix this. They tried for years. They funded domestic x86 clones through joint ventures like Zhaoxin. They tried to push Linux distributions, but the software gravity was too strong. The x86 clones were always 3 generations behind, running hot, loud, and slow. The dismissive nickname in the industry for Chinese domestic PCs was the government tax. Clunky, heavy machines that civil servants were forced to use for basic word processing, while they kept the sleek, fast Intel MateBooks at home for actual work. This felt like a problem with no real solution. You cannot out-engineer 40 years of software gravity, and you cannot out-manufacture a lithography embargo. Until Huawei decided that the only way to win the PC war was to stop playing it. So here is the question everyone in the semiconductor industry asked. If the x86 duopoly is a national security threat, why didn't China just build a world-class ARM chip for laptops, the way Apple did? Why did it take until the summer of 2026 for a sanctioned company to ship a competitive PC processor? The answer is that building an ARM chip for a laptop is a completely different physical challenge than building one for a smartphone. And the industry had a graveyard of failed attempts to prove it. Let me explain the physics of the PC Powerwall. In a smartphone, you have a massive thermal advantage. The device is only used in bursts. You open an app. The processor spikes to maximum power for 2 seconds. And then it idles. The battery is small, but the thermal envelope is manageable because the phone is rarely running at 100% capacity for 8 hours straight. A laptop is different. A laptop is a sustained compute machine. You open a spreadsheet with 1,000,000 rows, or you compile code, or you render a video, and the processor needs to sustain high performance for hours. If you take a mobile chip and just shove it into a laptop chassis, it will thermally throttle in 3 minutes. The silicon will get so hot that it will deliberately slow itself down to avoid melting the solder. To sustain laptop-class performance, you need a larger silicon die. You need more physical cores, and you need a manufacturing process that is incredibly power efficient. And here is where the sanctions trap snapped shut. To build a large 10-core ARM chip that doesn't overheat in a thin laptop, you absolutely need TSMC's advanced nodes. If you try to build a large PC chip on an older, less efficient node, like the deep ultraviolet multi-patterning nodes available to SMIC, the chip will draw too much power. The battery will die in 2 hours. The laptop will need a massive cooling fan, making it thick and heavy. Because of this physical reality, the Western consensus was absolute. The dismissive nickname for Chinese ARM PC attempts was the hot brick. Without EUV lithography, a Chinese PC chip would either be too slow to be useful or too power-hungry to be portable. You could make a desktop tower that plugs into a wall, sure, but a 700-gram ultra-thin laptop? Physically impossible. Furthermore, there was the software emulation nightmare. Even if you built the hardware, Windows on ARM was historically a disaster. Running x86 Windows apps on an ARM chip requires real-time translation, which eats up 30% of your processing power and drains the battery even faster. 3 walls: thermal physics, lithography limits, and software translation. The Wintel Fortress was secure. The hot brick would never compete with a MacBook Air or a Dell XPS. That assumption held for years, right up until Huawei realized they didn't need to break the walls. They just needed to change the building. Here is the twist, and this is the part that changes everything about the personal computer. Huawei did not try to build an Intel killer. They did not try to build a chip that could brute force its way through heavy x86 emulation on Windows. They looked at the Kirin 9030 Pro, their flagship mobile processor, and they asked a radical question. What if we just made it bigger and completely changed the operating system it talks to? The result is the Kirin XE90. And the mechanism behind it is a masterclass in system-level engineering. Step 1. The die size expansion. The Kirin XE90 is physically larger than its mobile counterpart. Huawei took the base architecture and expanded the silicon footprint to accommodate a 10-core CPU structure. According to the leaked and confirmed specifications, it features a tri-cluster design, including 4 large performance cores clocked at 2.45 GHz, backed by dedicated L2 cache, alongside medium and efficiency cores. By increasing the physical surface area of the chip, they spread the thermal load. More silicon means the heat is distributed over a wider area, which is the exact physical trick required to prevent thermal throttling in a thin chassis, even on a less advanced manufacturing node. Step 2. The efficiency obsession. The XE stands for extreme efficiency. Instead of pushing the clock speeds to 3 or 4 GHz, which would cause the power draw to spike exponentially, Huawei capped the frequencies and optimized the microarchitecture for instruct Q1s per clock. They prioritized battery life and thermal headroom over raw benchmark bragging rights. They accepted that they could not beat Intel in a sustained rendering race, so they optimized for the reality of modern work: web browsing, document editing, video streaming, and AI inference. Step 3. The operating system synergy. This is the kill shot. The Kirin XE90 was not designed to run Windows. It was designed from the transistor level up to run HarmonyOS PC. Because Huawei controls both the silicon and the operating system, they eliminated the translation tax. There is no x86 emulation layer eating up 30% of the CPU cycles. The software speaks to the ARM hardware natively. The memory management, the thread scheduling, the sleep states, All of it is co-optimized. And here is the brilliant part: the three old weaknesses of Chinese PC chips, the thermal throttling, the battery drain, the emulation lag, they do not get fixed by better lithography. They disappear because the substrate changed. The thermal problem is solved by die expansion and frequency capping. The battery problem is solved by native OS synergy. The software problem is solved by abandoning Windows entirely and forcing the domestic Chinese software ecosystem to compile natively for HarmonyOS ARM. They didn't build a better Intel, they built an Apple, but they did it without TSMC, and they did it for the domestic market. But architecture slides and press releases are one thing. A physical laptop you can hold in your hands is another. And this is where the story shifts from a theoretical workaround to an industrial reality. The Kirin XE90 is shipping right now inside the new Huawei MateBook Pro S. Let's look at the physical reality of this machine. It weighs 798 grams. That is less than 2 standard cans of soda. It is an ultra-premium, ultra-thin chassis that directly targets the MacBook Air and the high-end Windows Ultrabook market. The fact that a sanctioned company, using domestic multi-patterning DUV lithography, managed to pack a 10-core PC processor into a sub-800-gram thermal envelope is a staggering achievement in power management. It proves that the hot brick narrative is dead, and the deployment scale is where the real geopolitical shift happens. This is not just a consumer product. This is a state-directed infrastructure replacement. The Chinese government has been quietly but aggressively pushing the Xinjiang initiative, the domestic IT innovation and localization drive. State-owned enterprises, government ministries, and public universities are under strict mandates to replace foreign hardware and software with domestic alternatives. In the past, this was painful. Civil servants hated the slow, clunky domestic PCs. But the MateBook Pro S with the Kirin XE90 and HarmonyOS PC changes the calculus. It is fast, it is light, the battery lasts all day, the user experience is smooth. When the domestic alternative is actually good, the government mandate stops being a burden and starts being an accelerator. We are talking about tens of millions of units. The Chinese public sector represents a massive guaranteed market that allows Huawei to scale production, drive down the per-unit cost of the Kirin XE90, and iterate on the silicon year after year. They do not need to convince a teenager in Ohio to buy this laptop. They just need to supply the municipal government of Shanghai. Furthermore, the software ecosystem is following the money. Major Chinese developers, Tencent, Baidu, Alibaba, Kingsoft, are rapidly recompiling their flagship applications natively for HarmonyOS ARM, WPS Office, WeChat, DingTalk. The tools that run the Chinese economy are being optimized for the Kirin XE90. The software gravity is being rebuilt from the ground up in a second language. This is happening right now, today, in 2026. The Wintel fortress wasn't breached by an invading army. It was bypassed by a parallel city being built right next door. But here is the honest part of this story. And I want to be straight with you, because this format does not do blind hype. The Kirin XE90 is a monumental achievement in system integration, but it is not a magical replacement for high-end Western silicon, and pretending otherwise ignores the brutal physics of the global semiconductor supply chain. First, there is the raw performance ceiling. If you are a software engineer compiling massive code bases, or a video editor rendering 8K raw footage, or a hardcore gamer trying to play Cyberpunk, the Kirin XE90 will not beat a top-tier Intel, Core Ultra, or an Apple M3 Max. The domestic manufacturing node, while miraculous for its efficiency, simply does not have the transistor density or the peak clock speeds of TSMC's EUV nodes. Huawei optimized for the 90% of tasks that office workers do. For the top 10% of extreme workloads, the Western chips still hold the crown. Second, there is the global software isolation. HarmonyOS PC is a brilliant, fluid operating system for the Chinese ecosystem. But if you need to run legacy, niche, Western enterprise software that only exists as an x86 Windows executable, you are going to have a bad time. The emulation layer exists, but it carries a performance penalty. This machine is not designed for the global enterprise market. It is designed for the domestic Chinese market and the global South partners who are willing to adopt the Huawei ecosystem. Third, the manufacturing yield and cost. Producing a large 10-core die on a multi-patterning DUV process is expensive. The defect rates are higher than EUV. This means Huawei is paying a sanctions tax on every single chip they produce. They can absorb this cost right now because of the massive guaranteed government procurement contracts. But competing purely on profit margins in the open, global consumer market against a fully optimized Intel supply chain will be a brutal long-term grind. None of this erases what the engineering has already proven. It simply marks the distance between a sovereign survival tool and a global market dominator. The laptop is light, the battery lasts, the ecosystem works, the rest is yield, raw physics, and time. Which brings us back to the bigger picture this whole story has been building toward. Because this is not really about a laptop. It is about the end of the universal standard. For 40 years, the personal computer was a universal language. Whether you were in New York, Berlin, Tokyo, or Beijing, the machine on your desk spoke x86 and ran Windows. It was a single, unified, American-led technological ecosystem. That universality was the bedrock of the globalized digital economy. The sanctions were designed to keep China inside that ecosystem, just locked out of the premium tiers. The goal was to keep them as renters, but the Kirin XE90 represents the moment the renter decided to build their own house. By combining a scaled-up, highly efficient domestic ARM chip with a completely sovereign operating system, Huawei has successfully bifurcated the personal computing world. There is now the Wintel/Apple ecosystem, built on Western intellectual property and TSMC manufacturing. And there is the HarmonyOS Kirin ecosystem, built on Chinese architecture and SMIC manufacturing. Two stacks, two supply chains, two completely different technological trees. The world that ran on a single universal PC standard didn't announce its own ending. It just started losing ground to a machine that weighs 798 grams and doesn't need permission to boot up. So here is the question I want to leave you with, and I genuinely want your answer in the comments. When a country successfully builds a completely parallel sovereign computing ecosystem from the silicon up to the operating system, what happens to the global internet? Do we end up with two completely separate digital realities, two separate app stores, two separate internets that never truly talk to each other again? Drop your answer below. I read every single one. And if you want a front row seat for the next time a 40-year monopoly gets shattered by a piece of silicon, hit subscribe. The next decade of this story is going to move faster than anyone expects, and you are going to want to be here for it. I'll see you in the next one.